Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham, and welcome to California, the place that spends hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars on bridges that go nowhere and aren't even intended for humans, but rather for animals. What kind of crazy dimension have we stepped into? I'm breaking it all down for you today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. All right, so there is an absolutely crazy story that has been breaking out of California about a wildlife crossing that is being built in Southern California, about the activists who are promoting this crossing, and about how it is millions of dollars over budget, as well as behind schedule, as is usual in our state. So let me introduce you to the Wallis Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. Now, this is not a new project. This was introduced back in 2022 when Governor Gavin Newsom actually broke ground on the project in Agora Hills. And at the time, he committed $54 million from the annual budget to the project. Now, it was supposed to be finished last year, and that's why it's getting more attention than it has in the past, because it once again has gone over time, as pretty much every project does here. And additionally, the total estimated cost up front was $92 million. And that was between a mix of public funds, the ones that Newsom had committed, as well as private funding from different philanthropic groups. But to no one's surprise, that is also over budget. So this is a bridge that is over the 101 freeway that is in Agora Hills. So there are 10 lanes of freeway that this bridge has to extend over. This is the largest of its kind, the largest crossing to ever have been attempted or to ever exist. And what it's supposed to do is connect the Santa Monica Mountains to the Simi Hills. So it connects the north to the south there. And it's not actually purposed for humans, as I mentioned. It's not a bridge that you would be driving over. Instead, it's intended or purposed for animals to be able to cross over those 10 lanes of freeway. So why do we need a bridge for animals to cross the freeway? That's a great question. And that goes back all the way to the 1990s. So back in the 1990s, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy group wanted to study the impact that freeways have on certain wildlife groups and habitats. And so they conducted a study that showed that this specific freeway, the 101, actually broke up some type of habitat that was specific to certain wildlife. And so in doing so, they wanted to see if we could build some sort of connecting point, where would the optimal position be for a connection in order to reestablish that habitat cohesion, putting a habitat back together, and enable the animals that live in that habitat to move freely between both sides of the freeway. And so what it found was the exact location that this animal crossing has been built in. They found that that was optimal. Now, fast forwarding from the 1990s to 2002, that study lay dormant for quite a while. Nothing was really done over it. They said the spot would be great, and then no one acted. But in 2002, the National Park Service then conducted its own study, not just on habitat fragmentation, not just on the optimal place, but specifically on the main wildlife that were being affected by this freeway, and that is the mountain lion population. And so what they did is they actually literally put GPS trackers on the mountain lions that were living in these various hills, and then they tracked their movements. And what they wanted to see was how many mountain lions attempted to cross the freeway, how many were killed on the freeway as a result of it, and then was the population of the mountain lions actually dwindling as a result of the freeway. The results of this study showed that from 2002, when it was originally started, all the way to today, so over 24 years, that 32 mountain lions have been killed by the freeway. But in addition to that, they also found that not only was the highway affecting the population in the sense of killing mountain lions if they attempted to run across the freeway, but it was also promoting a type of genetic collapse. And so they found that the genes of the growing mountain lion population population are starting to decline in the sense that a lot of mountain lions are being born with birth defects. They have missing limbs. They have just entire parts of their bodies missing. They have weird tails. Things just are not going correctly. And they attribute that to the fact that mountain lions are having to inbreed because they are not able to cross the freeway in order to find mates. And so because of this inbreeding, it has caused genetic problems. And that obviously is going to create a much weaker and much more dysfunctional mountain lion population. But the biggest catalyst for this project, because believe it or not, all of that wasn't enough to get this crossing started. The biggest catalyst for the Wallis Annenberg wildlife crossing was a specific mountain lion affectionately known as P22. So Puma 22 was tagged as number 22, and he was a young mountain lion who was found in 2012 in a specific area of Southern California. He had crossed both the 405 and the 101 as a young lion, so he made it across several freeways, and he actually lived in a park that was surrounded by urban development. And as they tracked his movements, they saw that he couldn't get back to where he was originally born, and that he also couldn't get to areas where there were other fellow mountain lions in order to find a mate. And so he really became the face of this type of campaign. People were enamored with tracking his movements. People wanted to see what he was up to. There's questions of, will he ever get back? Will he ever find a mate? And what's funny is that even the news was doing spotlights on him. So the LA Times did a week in the life of P22 where they tracked his movements. They tracked what he ate and what he did. And people loved that. And then there was also a 60 Minutes episode done on his life and on his movement. So this just really started to campaign for the public to get involved in being aware of and wanting to help the mountain lion population. And so a lot of proponents of the wildlife crossing say that he really got the ball rolling for public and donor support for this project, which would come years down the line. He had a huge public impact. And so people still, again, when you read about P22, a lot of professionals, a lot of people in the conservation space speak of him very highly and say how sad it is that he's no longer with us and living in the population. And so this set the stage for our state, as well as for this conservancy group, to really do something about it. And that something is this wildlife crossing. And the goal of the crossing is simple. The goal is to help animals cross the freeway so that no longer mountain lions are killed on the freeways, so that the population is able to move more freely instead of being confined to one side of it, and so that hopefully the habitat could be rebuilt and that there would be less of these problems with inbreeding, that they can move freely and find mates, all of that. So that's what this bridge is, and that's why it was originally started as a project. But how did we get to the point that we're at today? How did it go through the legislative process? How did it go through funding? And then where does it stand? Originally, funding was coming from philanthropic efforts. And so Wallis Annenberg, who is the chair and CEO of this Annenberg Foundation, that's where the name comes from for this crossing, she gave $1 million in 2016 as a pledge to a wildlife crossing being built. And then years later in 2021, another pledge was made of $25 million. And that pledge was conditional on the campaign that was going to be put out to the public to raise an additional $10 million for a total of $35 million raised for this project. And so this was the largest donation ever made to a wildlife crossing, because I'm not entirely sure how many wildlife crossings there are or how many people donate to them. But anyway, this was the largest donation. And so it was really driven, again, by this foundation group. And this foundation focuses on the arts, education, animal welfare, and environmental stewardship. So it's no surprise that this is the perfect type of project that it would be pursuing. But at the same time, this wasn't just restricted to private funding. This also moved into the public sector. And so on the government side, as I mentioned at the top of the show, $54 million in our state budget was pledged back in 2021 to this project. And so already that overblew the amount that we had raised from a private standpoint. It was already far more. And so the government or taxpayer dollars were mostly footing the bill for this project. And then on top of that, Congressman Ted Lieu got another $2.5 million in federal appropriations specifically for Santa Monica projects. And so that could be used used toward this crossing. And then on top of that, Congress itself at a federal level set aside $350 million nationally for wildlife crossings. So this is not the only one that is in existence. This is an even national issue or a national type of project. And so some of that federal money could come to this specific project as well in California. And then lastly, the most wild step that was taken is our own government passed Assembly Bill 2344. And what that does is it requires Caltrans to systematically identify and address wildlife movement barriers across the state. So what started out as a philanthropic move to say, we care about animals and wildlife, so we are going to fund this type of project, ultimately radically shifted our state policy because they gained momentum on the public side and they gained momentum in the policy space. And so it shifted it. So now that our state is not just focusing on this one area where studies were conducted or on these mountain lions, but now saying that on a statewide level that Caltrans has to specifically be actively looking for areas where highways, where other types of barriers are that could potentially be separating habitats and could be a barrier to animals being able to move freely. So we have moved our public policy in this direction of caring very much about the ability for animals to be able to cross freeways. But even with all of that funding from the different spheres, and even with all of the public and political support, the crossing has not been completed. Now, there has been much more progress on this crossing than on other projects. Think of the high-speed rail that has not even laid tracks. So it has moved forward, and the actual bridge structure over the 101 freeway is complete. It's massive. It's huge. And that part is complete, but there's still work that needs to be done. So it wasn't actually completed by the 2025 deadline. So it still needs to extend over another 2-lane road because that's still another barrier. And then there are more projects that are wrapped into it. So they have to also balance protecting heritage oak trees. So it just affects everything in their attempts to build this bridge. It also affects the trees. And in California, certain trees are protected. And so they have to go about that issue first. And then they also have to finish utility relocation. So they had to relocate some of the utility lines, and they have to do that as well. So basically, it's running late. It's now projected for the fall of this year in 2026. We'll see if it's actually completed by then. And like I said, it is over budget as well. So originally, it was budgeted for $92 million, split between that $54 million in California dollars, and then the private funding and what they were able to raise through a campaign. Now the budget is up to $114 million, and that is mostly being footed by California. And so, like I have said many times, that's not really surprising in our state. Every single project runs over time and it runs over budget, but it does start to raise more attention and it starts to raise questions around this type of project that we're throwing our money at. So when it comes to how we should think about this wildlife crossing, first of all, it's kind of funny because there are some crazy people that are involved with this. Just take, for example, one of the main advocates for this crossing who seems a little bit interesting. I'll just play a clip of her.
So we need your help one more time to get us to the finish line and help us build back those reserves so that we can ensure that we finalize construction by November. I can't wait to see that first mountain lion cross. The promise to P22 will be fulfilled, and the Santa Monica Mountain wildlife will have a future because of all of you. Please donate today to Save LA Cougars, and we're going to complete this together, this dream that we started. Thank you for being a part of it.
So when you see things like that, it's easy for a lot of people to just brush off this project as another wild California thing that is happening and think that it's just insane that our state would even pursue this. And then on top of that, there are obvious pain points. Whenever something goes over budget, and whenever a project goes over time, there's automatically going to be heartburn, especially from people who maybe disagree at the outset of the project's stated goals. And so any project that's using taxpayer money, we would argue should be necessary and it should be well executed. And obviously this project, you could argue, haven't necessarily been both of those. And so there's going to be some issues, but those are all fairly obvious issues that I don't want to spend a lot of time on because I think there are deeper issues at play that really would get to the heart of how we got to this point of having a project like this that I think that we should address. The main question with a project or topic like this comes down to the concepts of environmental stewardship and conservation. And I think it's too reductionist for us to look at a project like this, just laugh it off and say that nature doesn't matter, that mountain lions don't really matter, and so we shouldn't have even addressed this at all and just move on. After all, American conservatism has a rich heritage that is rooted in conservation. So a lot of the national parks, wildlife refuges, habitat protections, those were all Republican priorities back in the 20th century. And so historically, we see that mountain lions actually could have fallen under some of these priorities and could have been championed by conservatives of the past. But at the same time, even though we care about the environment, and even though we say that we should steward the environment, it is also fair to ask, is this specific project that has been gone about the exact way that our government has gone about it, is that our only answer? Does that mean if we support environmental stewardship, that we automatically have to then support something like this wildlife crossing? And my answer to that question would be no. And let me break down why. The first consideration with all environmental projects, and really much more than just environmental, but other projects like this, is that government is not the answer and that taxpayer dollars are not the solution. So we even see this with this wildlife crossing. It was originally a private project that was being funded by a group that cared about animals and cared about the environment. That's fine. They can put their money toward it. And they raised money from the public. They had a public campaign that raised further money to be able to go to this crossing. Also fine. They're able to do that. But then we see that the government got involved and the government pledged far more money because the government has a lot more money than these private groups do. But the entire model of civil society and of philanthropic different institutions and of nonprofit organizations identifying problems and then working to fund the solution to those problems, that is the model that we as conservatives would champion. And we would say the same with other issues. We would look at homelessness, we would look at poverty, we look at people starving, and we see those as issues that should be addressed. But we shouldn't always just run to the government to address all of those. That starts to get into a larger government model that says the government is basically just the welfare system that needs to make sure that every person is clothed and fed. Well, I would argue that actually that's not what the purpose of government is for. Government restrains evil, government enacts justice, government makes sure that laws are in place to protect the citizens under its care. But it doesn't mean that it's going to make sure that you are always fed to the fullest extent that you want and that you are always prosperous. Instead, we see that there's a role for the church and there's a role for private organizations to step in, to make sure that the poor are fed, to make sure that the homeless are clothed, that they have resources to go to, places to go to sleep. And so we should be championing that model that says that if there's something you're passionate about, rally public support, raise the funds for it, and oversee that it's actually enacted. And you might have to work with government on some of those things, like building something over the freeway, obviously is going to involve the government, but we shouldn't be turning to the government to solve all of our problems. And I think we've seen that model start to fade. We've started to see where the government gets involved at every turn. And so now we look at something like wildlife and we look at habitats, and we have really put it on our government to say, you need to enact laws, you need to enact policies to be looking after the mountain lions. Why? Why is that the government's job? Why are we outsourcing our taxpayer dollars to these priorities? And the reason that question is important is because, especially in California, taxpayers are facing housing crises, crumbling roads, chronic budget deficits. There are many problems that our state is facing. There are many other priorities where money could be channeled. And so, like I've said before, government should focus on putting money toward the absolutely most needed and most effective places where it's going to go to make life better. And then it can move to secondary projects once it gets all of those things under control and once it gets even its own budget deficit under control. But we're sitting in a budget deficit and we have people who are hurting to pay their grocery bill, and yet we are also spending hundreds of millions on a crossing for animals. It just doesn't really seem like that should be the priority of the government, maybe for a private institution, but not the government. And that leads us to the second principle we have to think about, which is that when government gets involved, there are not only financial ramifications on the taxpayer, but there are policy ones as well. And so, like we see with this crossing, it moved from just being a single pet project, no pun intended, to now shifting radically the policy of our state and even being formative for the policy of our nation on issues like this. This was a catalyst for an entirely new framework. We passed an entirely new assembly bill that moved this to a statewide framework to say, okay, we're building this one crossing in this one area that was looked into by one or two groups, but now we're going to require Caltrans to look all across the state for where we can build more of these. And so that's a significant move that leaves the door open to asking the question of how many more projects that are going to cost more hundreds of millions of dollars are we going to be on the hook for because of this law that was enacted? When the government gets involved, it generates political momentum that is then channeled into permanent policy. And so we have to be very careful, especially with environmental policy, of completely changing all of the policy to get government involved at every turn that then is going to, again, leave the taxpayers on the hook for just endless projects. And all of that is answered really in our final principle, and that is looking at the hierarchy of priorities that are in front of us and making the necessary trade-offs to make sure that the most important things are prioritized first, and recognizing that not every single thing can have that first place spot. And so when we think about environmental stewardship, and when we think about these mountain lions, we have to understand that human civilization, our very nation, our very state, is all built on our ability to reshape the world around us to serve our uniquely human needs. And so all of our things, roads, agriculture, businesses, industry, all of these are going to in some way disrupt or displace the environment because we have to live here. We have to build. And so as more people are living here and more people need to get to and from work, and as we moved out of the industrial era into the revolution that says we're going to work in businesses and factories rather than only on farms, that means we need more roads. But if we build roads, that's inevitably going to move grass. It's going to move trees. And yes, it's going to separate wildlife. But when we look at that hierarchy of priorities, we see that humans have to be prioritized over some animals, plants, and wildlife. And we have collectively, as a society, accepted that cost because of the enormous benefit to human life. And because of the reality that it doesn't mean we have to wipe out everything environmentally. We can still be good stewards, but it does mean that some wildlife will change, some will adapt, and some, unfortunately, will suffer or go extinct. That's just kind of the reality of the situation. If these mountain lions are not able to exist the same way that they did, also at the same time as our human infrastructure, that may to some be seen as tragic, yet it would be acceptable. And why? Because humans are unique. We are uniquely rational and moral and creative beings. And the flourishing of our society and the flourishing of our world as a human society is primarily an ethical good. And so when we see that as the priority, when we see that where it lands in the hierarchy, then we see that conservation in its right place should not hurt or place human interests below those of animals or of the environment, because that puts us in danger of having an ideology of nature worship or subordinating the human race and human interests below those of animals. They can coexist. We can still make sure that we steward the environment, but we are in danger of now saying that humans should always be bowing, they should always be subordinating all of our interests to the latest species or the latest habitat that is in danger of being disrupted or going extinct. And the reason that this is important for us to identify is because this exact ideological shift is what has happened in our society in recent years, as well as specifically in our state here in California. Conservation began as an expression of human stewardship, but recently, over the last few decades, it has actually moved into treating humans as the problem rather than the solution. And we see this all around us. We see this with more radical agendas as well. We see this with climate change, that humans are the ones who are hurting the planet, that humans are the ones that are killing animals and wildlife and habitats and all of that. And so we should subordinate ourselves as the human race to all of these things. We should do everything in our reach in order to preserve the environment. But that's not conservation. Genuine conservation is confident about humanity. It says that humanity is powerful. It says that we are so powerful that we have the power to actually destroy things. Therefore, we have a responsibility to be careful stewards of the world that we have the power to shape. We should make sure that we are not just destroying everything that is in our sphere with no careful thought given to it. But at the same time, we recognize the importance of humanity, and we recognize that humanity does subdue the world around it. But we have seen a significant shift from that position of strength in conservation to instead just inherent guilt about being human. And that is not helpful at all. Instead, we are being told that human presence is inherently destructive and that it is something to be apologized for, it is something to be mitigated, it is something to be offset, and it's something that needs to be corrected. But again, I repeat that is not true stewardship. And unfortunately, that guilt is what leads us into situations like this, where we are actually only pursuing symbolic actions rather than effective ones. Because let's be honest, this wildlife crossing is not going to be supremely effective for making sure that this ecosystem flourishes and that that's going to benefit the society around it. This is one crossing. And even if you extend it to the rest of the state, simply building crossings for different animal species to be able to get across freeways is not automatically now going to preserve those species and going to make life far better. There are other issues for them to face. Wherever there is urban development, there are going to be other streets that they need to cross. There are going to be fences that are in the way of where they want to go. There are going to be urban areas where they are not allowed to be. And so they're still going to run up against those, even if they can safely cross the freeway. And additionally, let's just point out that in the past 24 years, there were 32 mountain lions killed. So the average of that is 1 to 2 per year. But the data actually shows that it was much more in the earlier years and that it has dwindled in recent years. And there are studies that show that mountain lions actually don't even try to cross the freeways anymore, that they have learned where their habitat is. And so a lot of times they'll kind of come up to the edge of it and then they'll back off and they go back into their habitat. And so this millions of dollars, this hundreds of millions of dollars bridge is a largely symbolic solution to a largely symbolic issue, when instead real conservation takes stock, again, of those priorities of where are the actual environmental issues. And California has real environmental issues that we should be prioritizing, that we should be stewarding. We think of water scarcity. We need to be stewarding our water supply because we live in a hot place that is prone to drought. And so we need to look at that. Additionally, wildfire prevention, because wildfires are very common to our state and they're incredibly destructive. And so we need to be looking deeper at things like forest management and making sure that we clear brush so that these fires can't catch and be as destructive as they have been. So there are real environmental issues. But if we let guilt drive our decisions, then that means that we just take symbolic actions to clear our guilt, rather than, like I said, those effective actions that are going to make the quality of life better for humanity. So this wildlife crossing is the exact result of this philosophy of guilt, and it has meant that we are spending $114 million, a large portion of that of which is taxpayer money, in a state where families cannot afford to live, they cannot afford housing, where they are running into other environmental issues like those water shortages or destructive wildfires. And so this just shows that our state consistently denies every priority that would actually be helpful to serve its human population in favor of serving animals, in favor of serving the environment, in favor of the broader climate narrative around it. And so while mountain lions are not the actual problem, it's not that I want mountain lions to die or go extinct any more than the next person. We have to be honest that it's the ideology behind this type of project, specifically from our state government and legislature, that is the true problem. We must course correct to return to a conservation ethic that begins and ends with human beings at center stage. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you even learned something new. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.